The first is arguably the single most important topic we'll address today. And we'll address it in an interactive way, as well as have two very smart people talking to you about 5G. And that, of course, is the shorthand term for fifth generation wireless technology that is very much a focus of effort of the Communist Chinese Party and the People's Liberation Army, which is doing business at the moment as a company called Huawei. And we're going to talk about that as a threat and 5G as an opportunity with two individuals, one of whom is not the one mentioned on the agenda, who just had an emergency with his network, and he has to go attend to that. So in his stead, I'm very pleased to have Jim Hoffman, who has turned up to listen in, actually turn up and have you listen to him a bit about his expertise, some 30 years of it in the business sector, involved in spectrum-related issues, which are at the core of what we'll be talking about today. What spectrum? Who's got it now? How could it be made use of to better effect to assure that we are, in fact, competitive with and preferably considerably superior to the Communist Chinese alternative, which is something they're busily trying to hook the rest of the world up to. In addition to him, we are very pleased to have with us Keith Walker, who has founded and is running a company called Air Wireless. I will give you a bit more background on him, or perhaps he can give you a bit more background himself when he comes up, because my information disappeared into a phone, which I have fortunately found, but not got access to at the moment. 4G, mind you, 4G. But I'm very pleased to welcome them both up. We'll take probably about 50 minutes to lay out both the stakes involved in 5G and what we need to be doing about it in order for our country and the free world to survive the current onslaught represented by Communist China's efforts to dominate this important new technological frontier. So Jim, if you and Keith would join me up here, you can welcome to use the podium if you'd like, or you can sit here at the table with me. But one way or the other, we will do this, and then hopefully be joined shortly thereafter by Congressman Scott Perry. Thank you very much. Welcome. So I believe the mic is hot. Which of you would like to go first? I'll assign you.
Yeah, that's
Jim?
fine. 5G has been an exciting area to talk about in the last few years.
Pull the mic closer, and can enough of you
How's
see
that?
this?
Does everybody hear me? Yeah, excellent. So 5G has been a very exciting thing to hear about in the last few years. I think some of the foundational things that are important from my perspective is that there's been incredible consolidation of the corporate entities involved in making decisions around 5G. So you have 2 or 3 very large players worldwide on the infrastructure side, and in any given market you've got 2 to 3 carriers. And that consolidation has driven a global desire to get everything standardized very quickly. And this is the first time that the China side has been heavily involved in setting of the standards through 3GPP and the other activities, which are almost intergovernmental in the way they're structured between the large corporate entities that plan them out. It's also an industry that's matured significantly. And if you see that there are limited number of players, 2 or 3 infrastructure manufacturers, many of them consolidated their investment over the last decade plus into China. And it was a logical decision for them on a corporate basis because they had to go to places where there was a market existing, there was a growing market existing, and there was a desire by the Chinese government, the party, to dominate this particular technology. So it's a thing that's been happening for a long time, but it's just surfaced for most people. The Chinese were very effective at it. They were active in all of the standards committees. They led many of the standards committees. They drove a lot of the engineering behind the standards committees. And from the perspective of a Chinese citizen, that would be a very successful outcome from the perspective of an American or a European buyer of that technology, I think everybody's woken up and said we need to take another look at this, and we need to decide on the fly often about these technologies because they're not necessarily predictable. We haven't operated in the millimeter wave spectrums the way that a lot of people are proposing. We've had tests, most of them low power, and so I would say there are a lot of risks associated with the deployment of major investments. We're not talking small investments. We're talking billion and trillion dollar type investments for new networks and new spectrum. And we have some of the best engineering companies in the world in Europe and the United States who are involved in the core technologies. But the Chinese have aggressively dominated this as part of their national strategy, aggressively and successfully. So their argument would be, we've aggressively and successfully won this playing field, and now the United States and Europe are having second thoughts for national security reasons. It's a normal bumping of sovereigns against each other in an arena that's very, very critical to us. And as the world matures and our internet matures, the wireless access and the wireless backbones behind the internet are going to become more critical. They're seen as national security issues. And the Chinese have planned a walled garden. We've planned an open system. Those two systems conflict. The Russians recently went for a closed system officially. I think it was this week they made that decision. So you're going to see what's been described by some pundits as splinter net. I actually see it as a set of spheres filled with little bubbles. I don't know how many large spheres there'll be. There'll be one that looks like the Chinese model. There'll be one that looks like the Western European American model with lots of subset, sub-rules within it. That's how I see it. So I'm not too worried about the concept of total splintering. But I do think that there's going to be a balkanization of all of the large spheres of influence in defining networks and the internet. So that's enough blathering. I'll hand it over to my cohort here.
Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to the organization for inviting us to speak. We take a little different approach into going what Mr. Gaffney said about the company. Air Wireless works with a company called Mage Networks. I had the good fortune to have my former business partner, Dr. Hatem Zaglug, who invented Wi-Fi, and he went his way, and the CEO at the time, Dr. Saeed El-Hamamsi, a Caltech grad, with about 46 patents, happened to be working in an oil field for a friend, and I believe you're in the oil business or the gas business, and to find where the gas or the oil is, sometimes they use detonations and seismic reading. That led to the invention of a new form of Wi-Fi that we have kept stealth up until one night I got a call from Kevin Jessup about 11:30 at night, and we delved into a few things. So I'll try to be brief. When you hear about 5G, as just explained to you, we are taking a different approach. The technology that we're using is Wi-Fi, and many of you, when you connect to your Wi-Fi at home and you step out the door, it's gone until you get to a Starbucks or until you get to your office. Well, this new form of Wi-Fi really is taking off-the-shelf equipment made here in America. It is both equipment and spectrum agnostic, and we flash the chipset on that device from Ubiquiti and now turn the access point that we would put in our homes or businesses and turn it into a completely different animal. So instead of having a range of about 100 to 300 feet, this new equipment now has a range of 4.9 miles. Okay. However, at that range, we lose 5% of the capacity we put into the network. The other problem that's had, and I'm not going to delve into technology because I don't want to lose any of you, but I just need to set these basic foundations. The other problem with Wi-Fi today, as it sits, when you move from one access point to the second access point, that's okay. But when you try to move from the second access point to the third access point, the signal drops and you have to reconnect. So that makes it not ideal for the type of communication that we're envisioning for 5G. So with what we have and tested by Dr. El-Hamamsi and his team, we are able to take unlimited number of hops or handoffs. So in other words, if we blanketed Washington, D.C. with our technology, you can walk from here probably to where the border of Alexandria would start and be able to stay connected. Would not drop. The other advantage is the only technology available to give you what we refer to as symmetrical speeds, meaning the speeds that you're given down, and you will find most of the carrier will talk about the downlink speed. The other critical point is the uplink speed. So with what we are proposing, we can deliver a minimum of 25 megabits per second uplink and downlink. Whatever speeds we deliver to the customer, that speed is symmetrical. Today, as I sit here, we are able to deliver 1 gigabit per second wirelessly. So now you can get your kids out of the house and take them with you, and they can stay connected. So back to 5G for a minute. One of the key things you're going to hear about 5G is IoT, or the Internet of Things. Just about every device in your home, and if you don't know, if you recently bought a Samsung refrigerator, it has a Wi-Fi chipset in it. They're very inexpensive, and when you think about IoT, we're talking about telemedicine, we're talking about your cars, and just about every device and apparatus having that chipset. With the advent of IoT, you were talking before, I remember back in the days where we would talk about terabytes, then it went to petabytes. Now they're looking at exabytes. With this advent of IoT, we are going to need a network that can handle what I refer to as the humongous or Google amounts of data that the network is going to be able to carry. And the other key thing is the connectivity that we're going to need for that. We are proposing and trying to get the various bodies to take a look at what we're doing. Because with what we're doing, and this is something that we're very passionate about, farmers in rural America and homes and residents in rural America are fighting to get the carriers to come there to deliver the broadband that they need. And in what we're able to do with what we do, we can deliver that. And one other key component is we don't need towers. If one of our units drops out, the network will self-heal and go around. You may or may not notice it, depending on how it's designed. But what we envision is in America or wherever we deploy it, and we're looking to deploy it as I sit here in several countries overseas, a network that will deliver blazing fast speeds for low cost of infrastructure. And I believe yesterday on a conference call that was had, Dr. El-Hamamsi said that he and this technology will knock a few zeros off of the cost of infrastructure to be deployed. So with something like this is something that is created here. We don't have to rely on any outside or foreign entity to provide equipment. It is all here. And the key thing is, one of the challenges that the FCC has is with spectrum. Which spectrum are we going to take next and make available? And the beauty of the firmware is that the firmware is both equipment and spectrum agnostic. So there's much more I can say, but I will stop there and allow for any questions from anyone.
Thank you very much. Let me just back the lens up a little bit with both of you, because we kind of jumped into a bit of technology and specific solutions to the challenge. But you touched on something, Keith, that I want to make sure that is calibrated here. We are moving into a world, whether we like it or not, in which a so-called Internet of Things is going to operate. And what that exactly means is something I'd like you to sort of develop a little further. You mentioned that a refrigerator or some piece of equipment in your home has a 5G, hookup. But as a practical matter, what does a world connected by 5G at every level basically mean in terms of the degree to which whoever runs that network has knowledge about, insights into, access to the data about your life, and an ability to exercise control over it, perhaps malevolently.
I will preface my response with this: security, plain and simple. But not just security as we see it for ourselves. And one thing I did not say at the beginning: I'm ex-military. There's never ex-soldier. You're always a soldier. But I'm a paratrooper, and security for our military is key. And so, therefore, when I preface the question with security, our networks must be secure, and as part of the Constitution, you have the right to be secure within your home, meaning you don't have to give anything to the government unless you really need to. So that's one of the key things. And what we are envisioning, or what you reference in 5G, just about everything, your refrigerator, your car. And as much as I work in technology, a couple years back, so I'm embarrassed to say that my car wasn't working. Something was going wrong. And when I went to the deal, I found out it was software in the car. And so if that happens to me, I can only imagine what it would happen to with people. But we're talking about everything connected. And we have used some form of IoT already. And if I tell you what it is, you would smile. I'm sure all of us here have gone to a hotel, and there was a minibar, and there were things in the minibar that you might have used. And you never told anyone what you used, but when you checked out, you look at your bill, they had a charge for the soda or the peanuts. So there was a sensor somewhere in that refrigerator, okay, that picked up what you use. So now translate that to the bigger world, okay? Your refrigerator's hooked up to this network, and you have things in there, and it knows from the manufacturer whether you bought milk or eggs. There's a barcode on there. So just imagine in sensors being able to read the barcode, and before you even open the fridge, there's an LCD screen that tells you your milk has one more day to be used, or you need to buy eggs. So I don't want to go too off in a tangent, but the information is phenomenal. But one last part is, and this is something that is also important, it hits home why the network is crucial. If I live in rural America and I have no access to broadband, and I just had artificial heart installed and planted in me, and it has a Wi-Fi chipset, I'm in trouble. If I live in the city, it might not be the case that much, because it would be able to connect to a Wi-Fi network and tell my cardiologist, hey, I need to come in and have the device tweaked. But if I live in rural America, I may not have that choice. And these are just some of the things. When you look at telemedicine, and you might have seen Amazon and others showcasing having your medication delivered. So these are all things to think about when we think about IoT and living in a truly connected world.
Well, in a world that, again, if it's connected to a Chinese communist, cell, shall we say, or operating unit, that would presumably have security implications as well as perhaps physical, public safety considerations. You think about the autonomous vehicles that are operating on the nation's highways, governed by this sort of Internet of Things 5G system. It would not be a stretch, I would argue, that could be a disaster for people most immediately in the car, needless to say, but perhaps for a highway system. Anybody been on a road in the District of Columbia or elsewhere in this region in which one car craps out? Imagine if lots of them do simultaneously. It's not a pretty thought. Jim, did you have anything you wanted to add on?
You had one thing you wanted to add?
Oh,
well,
sorry.
what I wanted to add is we look at the rules and regulations that are on the books with regard to how consumers' confidential information is handled. And what I was mentioning, Jim, is the GDRP, or the rules that are set in Europe, are quite extensive in terms of protecting the information and what the IT companies can and cannot do with your information.
I've got a quick set of points.
Go ahead, please.
As to privacy, the U.S. is behind in individual privacy. Europeans are very much in advance of us because they're in smaller pools where the feedback is gotten at governmental level on a sovereign state level much faster. And the EU is very interested in this, and they're interested in it in some ways in a competitive way, which is American companies have dominated, the FANGs have dominated the global market for this stuff. And so there's pushback from the Europeans to take over some of these services themselves. Looking at individual rights is very important to them. Would you like me to talk about lighter networks as well?
As you wish. I'm interested in spectrum
Okay,
issues,
sure.
especially because I think what we're dealing with as a public policy issue at the moment, as many of you are aware, is the president has been induced to believe that if he uses millimeter wave spectrum, that will enable this system, that will enable getting to the rural communities. I'm hearing a lot of people say, no, there's another part of the spectrum that the military owns at the moment, sub-6, I think it's called.
Sub-6 is
Talk a bit
controlled,
about this as a public policy choice built into this decision about what do we do on 5G.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time looking at spectrum allocations worldwide, and one of the things that's really surprised me here in the United States is we have all of this open frequency below 6 that's allocated towards government use that really doesn't take a lot of use. We have our existing 802.11 networks in that arena. There's a lot of opportunity with, as you described, from using Ubiquiti chipset, using other products that are off the shelf, Western made. You can build products that feed that sub 6 gigahertz market, can build out networks that are very dynamic. And there was quite a movement underway for solutions in this arena. And it's been very dampened by the marketing surrounding the 5G delivery, which has been monolithic and very large. The 5G community has gone around the world and said, if you don't allow us access to all of your spectrum, we will not be able to do the infrastructure promises around 5G. I think that there are periods of time that we could stage into these new technologies and utilize existing technologies, much as described, using the 802.11 spectrum, using the spectrum that's controlled by the government. And this doesn't mean the government gives it up. It means the government always has a chance to come back and say, for emergency purposes, we need that spectrum. But there is a lot of spectrum. They don't need it all. I think most of the desire for large blocks of spectrum is ease of use, convenience, and strategic positioning. Again, when you have 2 or 3 large multinationals by nature, they will discuss competitive positioning, and that means excluding new solutions that don't fit with their strategies. And they're limited. 5G is going to be very expensive. So existing wireless solutions, things that are off the shelf in Europe, like the LoRa and Sigfox solutions, which would be almost a 0G solution, very low bit rate. These things are deployable now. They're deployable in volume. They're deployable at low cost. And then there's the whole other arena where you have to start looking at where your semiconductors are manufactured. And I know that the government here has been through that discussion. China has a lot of the semiconductor fabrication capacity in the world. This creates an issue for lots of companies that are involved in secure networks and perfect security. There's perfect security, and then there's not perfect security. And there are a lot of smart people out there looking at what that means right now.
Well, there are a bunch of acronyms there that are incomprehensible to me and probably to others in the room. But I think one other piece of this that I'd like to just have you quickly talk about, and then we'll open it up, is, as I understand it, and I think you've sort of alluded to this, Jim, there is an opportunity using one or more of these technologies, if the spectrum is available, to dramatically reduce the costs to American consumers of having this 5G service, or having, for that matter, any mobile service. This is something that I didn't know myself, but I was told the other day that, well, I can tell you from my own personal experience that I feel gouged every time I open my AT&T or Verizon bill, but that second only to Cyprus, we have the highest costs for mobile service in the world, and that many places have a tenth of the cost. So can you just speak to, the approaches that you're talking about and how they can drive down those costs, which I would think would make this a very, very attractive idea for the American people?
First off, let's presume 5G networks are deployed across the country. The phones that you're holding in your hands will not work on that 5G network. which means, as you might have seen in some instances, I believe it was either Verizon or AT&T offered their customers that wanted to use the existing or the newly deployed 5G networks something called a sleeve you put on your phone. And that is like trying to put a Band-Aid to someone who's gushing blood with a wound. So what will need to happen is your phone, if you are, for the consumer, if they're on some kind of payment plan with their existing phones, they're going to have to, and one of the things to address is, what am I going to do now? Am I still going to have to pay for this phone that I no longer can use on this 5G network because I now have to go out and get a new phone for the 5G network? That's one. The other thing I want to touch on is rural America. And you will hear me go back there because there's so much information and things that we learned there. Some time ago, the carriers stated to the various governments and stuff that it is not financially feasible to deploy broadband in the rural community, especially where there are lots of farms and there's one home or two homes on the road, okay, to put fiber or solution. And so when you think about that, and when you go some places 40 minutes from here, down in Fauquier County, that's my favorite spot, law enforcement are go into certain areas and they have no communications with 4G. Okay, they have no communications with the radios in their car. And I once heard a story of a deputy dispatched to domestic violence, and there were issues because he had no communication. So going back to the costs of that, here's my take. If it costs too much to deploy a 4G mobile solution to fix the rural broadband issue, how then are you going to justify it on a cost basis to deploy 5G where you're going to have to deploy many more base stations because the propagation of the signal or the signal that is sent out has a shorter range? That means you're going to have to spend more money. And it's not adding up. I dare say it may be a fallacy or an inducement to get what is required from the various agencies to allow for deployment in those areas where it makes more sense on a business basis. The bottom line, then, I have you, what is going to be the cost? Our approach to this is that we can help them solve the problem with the backhaul. There was, and to touch on this, one last point, then I'll turn it over to Jen. Up in Sacramento, don't quote me on the zip code, but up in Sacramento, 28 base stations were deployed for 5G, covering 1,097 homes. And of those 1,097 homes, only 30 could be served with the base stations. There's far better solutions, and our approach to this is, and back in 2010, I made the statement, and I still stand by it. Today, the consumer wants the connectivity to this device, whether they're at home, whether they're on a trail, or wherever. And that's the other issue. Will the companies deploy 5G on trails? I've heard horror stories from the Virginia E region where there's lots of trails. Individuals were hurt and they had no signal. What we're talking about not only will deliver the data, but in using 911, we are able to place the emergency responder within 200 meters of you instead of what would happen.
Great. Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, what's being discussed here is innovation on existing solutions in a lot of ways. In 802.11 and the frequencies around the spread spectrum free access.
I just have to intervene. What is 802.11?
802.11 is the network. 802.11 is the standard network in your house, and there are variations on that. There have been, I think, we're on 6 versions now.
We are on, so there's 802.11, the first one.
Mike.
The first one out the door was 802.11a. You had B, you had G. Okay. What I reference here.
I've got more information than I needed. I just wanted to be clear what it was.
Bottom line, Wi-Fi.
Wi-Fi.
It's the stuff in your home.
Great.
And it's also been used in industry, and it can be adapted very well. It's a very solid, very simple system, low cost, comes off the shelf, which I think is really the issue here. A lot of this in engineering is already existing. It performs very well. And the gap between now and when we see intense 5G delivery, even in metropolitan zones, is years away. The rural divide is still a major issue in developed countries like the United States. And the cost factor of putting new sites in rural areas is prohibitive from the standpoint of capital availability. And that won't change for the next
So
5 to 10 years.
We are going to need access to sub-6 spectrum, and we'll figure out the technology
I
that
believe
will
so.
enable us to use it most efficiently. Okay.
Absolutely.
Let's open it up. Are there any questions or translations that can be provided? Go ahead, please. Behind you, sorry. Behind you. Thank you. We'll be next to you, French.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Katie Wang with NTD TV. Because we know the Trump administration have this strategy just depending on the private sectors to run the 5G system. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about this strategy, since security is so important a piece in this overall system? Yeah.
The private sector is what you were saying there? Yeah.
It's a very good question. I think one of the things about the United States is we use the private sector aggressively in ways that other countries wouldn't find possible. The private sector can deploy this. The private sector has to be asked to deploy it by the consumer, by their customer base, by corporations, and they have to be allowed to do it by the people who control the spectrum and some of the principal organizations that control the spectrum. So it'll be a private sector solution here in the United States, my opinion.
But it's also been said that you won't get a secure system if the private sector is left to its own devices, a la so much of what we've seen with the internet so far.
That is correct, which is why we're taking the approach that the best solution is the 802.11 AC, AD, and AX. When again going back to the military is very strong proponent of Ethernet because of the inherent security features of it, and thus with what we would suggest, our solution would be a hybrid system where connecting to the customer's end device, connecting to the home, if fiber is not available, because we will never, and no one has ever tested how fast fiber can go. But the bottom line is, I stated earlier, the consumer wants the connectivity to this thing in their hands or to their car, and that is where our position is 802.11 or Wi-Fi is a much more secure solution.
Good. Okay. French, please
Yes,
identify
it's been-
yourself. I know who you are.
My name is French Wallop, and I'm very interested in what you're talking about on the security dimension of the storage, perhaps, of what you're with the air Wi-Fi. How will you handle this mega amount of storage? Will you use data centers, secure data centers in the area, or will you? How will you manage all of this information that'll be flying over our heads with no collection ability unless it's yours?
So what we are talking about is the connectivity and the transport.
Right.
There would be other entities that would be responsible or that would house a repository of that data. All we're going to do is take it from you, whether you are at home or whether coming from this device, and allow you faster connectivity, let's say 100 megabits per second up and down, and transport that to a network core. And at the core of the network, there could be XYZ company that we build a network for, who then has to decide on the PCI compliance and the other government ways in which they handle that customer's data. So as far as the storage, that's another party.
Part of the teaming that's going to have to take place here.
Correct. Correct. So to add part of that, I know that Dell is very steep in IoT and how that data is going to be handled, massaged, and data mined. So the person who would be able to speak more to that, unfortunately, he's not here. He's actually given a presentation in Vegas at Hicks.
And let's hope in this case, what happens in Vegas is not going to stay in Vegas.
Can I give a quick little?
Go ahead, please.
so the data component of the communications component, it's a network, right? So we're talking about it's a continuous solution. The handoff, and this is one of the decent things about consolidation, is you end up with 3 or 4 very large players who have multiple solutions, all of which are very reliable from the standpoint of security. So you'll have Microsoft, you'll have AWS, you'll have them providing customized solutions. So if it's an agricultural product, you set the parameters for your requirement, the data size. You're talking seismic, massive data. It's a higher price. Security is the difference. How proprietary is it? But you're able to stack that with the cloud suppliers now. The issue is they're moving things on American networks through American fiber, through American cable systems. It's a different risk than things internationally. And so you have to take all these components into hand. That exists now, and it's pretty good.
Pastor Fu? Yeah. You might introduce yourself too.
Yeah, I'm Bob Fu from China 8. Prime Minister Theresa May fired her kind of a defense secretary over the supposed leaking of her decision to deploy Huawei 5G equipment. Apparently, her argument is, equipment is neutral or something, and of course, as long as the software is the UK, then it will be safe. I mean, given UK is one of the 5 eyes, right? Do you? My question is, is her theory right? As long as the Chinese made in China hardware is fine and the software is in the free country, it should be safe.
Mr. Fu, I really can't comment on why she did it, the basis of her statement, or what was the rationale. But it would put me into an area that right now I don't feel comfortable going into without having all the specific facts. However, if something is made here in the U.S. And it's the equipment is made here, it's used here, the software is made here, I'm tend to feel more secure about that scenario. But the scenario in which you described with what took place, I wouldn't want to touch that one.
To your best knowledge, the kind of hard equipment, is it possible to have a backdoor? Because that's a dispute, among various experts. China, of course, wants to argue.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in my days at Lucent Technologies, when we sold PBXs and the PBXs were deployed, and that was technology coming out of Bell Labs, whenever a system was installed, there is I don't want to call it a backdoor in a sense, but there's a remote link to the PBX that is closed. Oftentimes, back in the day, where you found companies wound up with million-dollar phone bills was because the installer did not close that link, and you had individual persons who knew it was open and would make calls. So they would come into the system, make telephone calls on the company's dime, and the company would get the bill. But looking at it from a data perspective, just about all of the PBXs sold in the world and switches had that. It's called a COM port, a communication port. So if you, the carrier, had the system and there was a problem, you couldn't fix it, your engineers couldn't fix it, then that allowed the manufacturer to immediately come in. From my days at Lucent, one of the things that with the customers I dealt with, they typically, and one of the key things before that switch was commissioned and turned over, it was imperative as a checklist that you made sure that COM port was closed. And when the company had a problem, then one of the internal techs of the company would go in and make it open to the carrier. So in the instance where equipment is deployed, regardless of who makes it, there's a COM port on there. And yes, that COM port could be misused. I hearken my friends to go back and look at the movie Paycheck with Ben Affleck when, he was kicked out, but he left a little back door for himself where the company could not use the system because he had a chip on there and they couldn't find it. Okay, now that's a movie. I don't know if it's reality.
Jim, any quick thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. people have been talking about this for decades now, given that semiconductor production has moved overseas, out of the United States, out of Europe. So as the systems get more complicated, and semiconductors are a commodity, you buy a bag of, and they come delivered to your office. They're often handled by distributors. You don't know really what their provenance is. So there is risk in semiconductor based on historical things. Actively, I think people are much more sensitive to hardware faults and vulnerabilities. Post 9/11, I think people have been paying a lot of attention to it. So it goes back to my earlier comment. It has to do with how good is the security need? Are you approaching the 100% mark? That's very expensive and very complex. Put it in classics. This is crossing the river by finding stones sometimes. It's hard. But if it's an important issue, people will spend the time and money to do it.
One of the things that I've been told in connection with all of this is the importance of having a supply chain that you can rely on. And unfortunately, I'm told that Nokia and Ericsson phones are also now using chips that are out of the supply chain of China, and that raises a question as to can we rely on them either. Thank you, Bob, for the question. Chet, we're going to take your question last.
Thanks.
Introduce yourself, please.
Hi. Can everybody hear me?
No, that doesn't seem to be operating. Didi, could we have the other mic, please? Nope. Why don't we just use the other mic while we're working that one out? Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Am I on now?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Chet Nagel. I've been working on the 5G issue and getting opinions from experts like Mr. Hoffman there. I want to paint a picture and then ask a question. The major carriers like AT&T and Verizon are talking about wanting to buy at auction millimeter wave frequencies. This is very high frequency stuff. And they insist they have to have it. There is an opposite camp which says you don't have to auction off the frequencies. You can go into what they call sub-6. And there was a Defense Innovation Board that's sanctioned by the government that in April last month came out with a study that basically said the United States can deploy 5G using the sub-6 frequency area. And as was pointed out by the panelists, that area is owned by the Department of Defense. Nothing can change that. Once 5G is deployed, for example, using Wi-Fi as a distribution, you break the divide issue. Now Wi-Fi is available in rural areas. And you will also be able to drop the cost to the consumer by 40%. So instead of me paying $80 a month, I'll pay 40. That'd be great. I'm still more expensive than a lot of other people, but it's cheap. Now the picture here is millimeter wave technology. These frequencies are so high that there has to be not only line of sight between the antennas, but they have to be close. If there's a heavy fog, they can't communicate. If a person walks between them. So there'll be an antenna on every utility pole in the city, thousands and thousands of them. I'm not quite sure what they would do in an apartment building, for example. So visualize all these antennas, and they're radiating in the millimeter frequency, very high frequency. 180 scientists asked the EU last year to do more research on what the effect on human people, on animals, on life is of this radiation. Now you have a millimeter wave transmitter in your house. It's called a microwave oven. The only reason it doesn't cook you too is that oven is encaged in a Faraday cage And those of you who know a Faraday cage is something that blocks all radiation. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to get near that microwave oven. So these 180 scientists asked the EU to do more experimenting on these frequencies and their health danger. Well, it was turned down, of course, because there's a lot of money involved here. Carriers don't want to hear things like that. So my question is, how dangerous is the millimeter wave spectrum to us?
Thank you very much. Chet is also, by the way, a member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. Gentlemen?
I'm not an expert on the health effects of millimeter wave and high frequency energy, but I agree with you. It's an area that needs to be studied again before we leap into putting these things along every board. I've heard them described as large egg cases that go up and down flat panels and have direct line of sight down major streets. So it's a big infrastructure piece, and they will be radiating energy, and people are very concerned about that. I think one of the things about millimeter wave that's always been interesting to me is we're using a lot of it for very specialized things. And the industry has come out and just said, we just need it all. And I think some countries have come out, and it's usually the larger countries that rely on millimeter wave for satellite communications and other applications. They've come out and said, well, wait a minute. Let's, you've got enough spectrum here below 28, below 19. We can fit you in very well and not disrupt our satellite communications. So I think the recent one was India. India came out and said, great, you guys, we're really happy you're here. We hope you do rural. They crossed their fingers on the rural thing, and then they blocked out what they felt were the strategic frequencies that they use. So again, not an expert on the health effects, but I've always been told stay away from emitters.
Good idea.
I'm not a scientist or a physicist, but I will state this about what I know. A couple of weeks ago, Brussels announced that it has banned 5G from deployment. And the EU has very specific standards for not just the consumable foods for its citizens, but also for things like radiation. Now, one of the issues are that the higher, and what the carriers have been doing, it's going in higher frequencies. And what that is going to do is create issues with the radiation. Now, the carriers have basically pressed their case to the legislators to allow them and pass laws to basically state to the various states across the nation to allow them to put the base stations on electrical poles, and even in some instances in any vertical structure such as a light. From everything that I've read and everything I've seen, and what I saw were scientists who said that the exposure to the radiation coming off of the 5G base stations alters the chromosomes in our body and the cells, basically, and will lead to cancer. So if you look at what's going on, you will see that the towers for the 4G are 200, 300 feet up in the air. But now you're talking about a base station that's going to be on an electrical pole. We believe there's a better solution, and that solution is to get the government to take a hard look at using the existing Wi-Fi frequencies and the existing equipment to deliver a solution not just for the cities and the companies, but also for rural America and the farmers.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you very much for most stimulating and, in some cases, quite mind-numbing discussion of this topic. It's vitally important that we do get our heads around it, and I appreciate you helping us do that today. Thank you very much for joining us.